Hey folks, it's Pastor Dave again. Thanks for continuing to join us through our discussion of communion and the sacraments. And today we're going to talk about one of those churchy words that we say comes through communion, which is grace. Now, grace is one of those words that we use all the time, but we kind of don't have a real good handle on what it means. It's kind of like love. The more you try to define it, the more it slips through your fingers. But let's try this. Grace, we know, is a gift from God, an expression of God's love that transforms the world. We don't bring it, we don't earn it. I don't get grace because I'm so special or smart or a pastor or whatever. You don't get grace because you're rich or brilliant. We get grace because God loves us, and that's it. Now, grace is an abstract term on its own. It's kind of like love. We say, what is love? And we have a hard time seeing what it is in the abstract. Instead, we see it by its results. If you love your children, you're probably feeding them mac and cheese on a Thursday night. If you're not feeding them, if your love doesn't transform their lives somehow, then we begin to suspect maybe the definition isn't that great. Now, grace can't be defined definitely, but we can see some of its results. And my favorite way to put this is grace is God's love poured out into a broken world. We all know that the world is not perfect. I often say, when we are born, the first three things we think are, man, it's cold, man, I'm hungry, and who the heck are all of you? The instant we get to the planet, we know a need inside. We know fear, we know bewilderment, we know we're reaching out to something, and we need something to fill us. And really, much of our lives is spent trying to find what that thing is. Now, as we'll talk about in a minute, nothing of this earth really ends up doing the job. Every time we eat, when we're full, we're going to get hungry again. When God sees this, God gives us grace that transforms our brokenness and emptiness into fullness and the potential for love. Now let's talk about a couple of the ways in which we all know the world is broken. We all experience loss, whether it's the loss of something precious to us, the loss of someone through separation or even death. And we all know what it's like to feel that loss that will not be healed. Grace transforms that loss into love. We all know what it is to fail, to fall short, to want to do something so badly that we can't quite manage. And when we run up against that wall, or when we fall down, or even when the world fails us, grace turns that failure into forgiveness. We all know what it's like to do things wrong, to, as we say in church, to sin, to make mistakes. Grace says that sin will not have the final word, that instead that sin is transformed into salvation, togetherness with God and each other, in love and joy, the way we were meant to be instead of the way we're able to be here. Let's do a little illustration of how this works. Let's say we're out in a field somewhere and something hurts us. It digs a crater in our lives, right? And you can see here, look, the crater. And we can try to fill that hole inside of us ourselves. We just turn around, look, there's lots of dirt. We dig it up and we fill the hole, and now the hole is filled. But now look, we turn around and another hole. And every time we try to do this ourselves, we just end up, at best even, digging one hole to fill another. Or as the world continues to break or hurt us, we get more holes and more divots, and all of a sudden it becomes hopeless. But when grace comes, it's like water, filling up those holes. Now, you can still see the emptiness where it was. You can still see the pain. You can still see the brokenness. But it's not entirely empty anymore. The water fills it to the brim. So now it's level with the rest of the ground. And even if it's not quite the same, even if nothing will fill that loss the way it was, still there is something usable there. There is something to drink from. There is something to splash in. There is something that matters. Not just the pain and emptiness that the world dug into us. Another way we can see ourselves is like a cracked pot. Now, the pot will contain things, but eventually the cracks are going to catch up to whatever you put in there. Pour all the water in there you want, it looks full for a moment, you come back an hour later and it's empty, and you're angry and frustrated. I thought I filled this thing. But we know that it's never going to be full that way. Now, a lot of people suggest that God is in the business of patching up those cracks. I've never found that to work. No matter how much we're taught, no matter how good we try to be, it still ends up being cracked. God is not in the business of putting temporary bandages over our seemingly permanent issues. Instead, when there is a hole in us too big for anything of this world to fill, even ourselves, God fills us with infinite grace. And that grace becomes like a constant fountain flowing into our pot. And now look what happens. Even though the pot is still cracked and spilling out, when we look, it is full, because infinity will fill everything to overflowing. And those cracks that used to hurt and harm us, that used to be the bane of our existence, that we used to hide from everybody, now just become one more way in which God's grace is spilling into the world through us. So the parts that are solid are serving their purpose, holding in the water and the grace that we might enjoy and drink from it. And the parts that are less solid are still serving their purpose, becoming a demonstration of God's love and God's grace triumphing over our own brokenness. That's an amazing, beautiful story, and it is the gift of grace that we get through the sacraments. We'll see you next time.